The courtroom battle begins. The courtroom was filled with an unsettling silence, the kind that made even the most seasoned lawyers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Thomas Wexler, a man known for his firm but fair rulings, sat at the high bench, flipping through the final pages of the case file. This wasn't just any custody battle. It had become the town's most talked-about case, drawing reporters, legal analysts, and a sea of curious onlookers. Danielle Carter sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers clenched together on the table in front of her. Once a devoted mother, she was now portrayed as reckless and negligent by her ex-husband's legal team. She barely glanced at her son, who sat between the attorneys, his small hands gripping the edges of his chair as if holding on for dear life. Across the courtroom, Gregory Miles exhaled sharply, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit. For 6 months, he had fought relentlessly for full custody, insisting Danielle was unfit to raise their son. His lawyer painted a picture of him as the stable, responsible parent, a father doing everything in his power to protect his child from a careless mother. But behind the polished suit and confident demeanor, there was something else. A tension in Gregory's jaw, a stiffness in his shoulders. The audience was so quiet that the steady ticking of the courtroom clock could be heard between breaths. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the final decision. Judge Wexler lifted his gavel slightly. After reviewing the testimonies and evidence presented, he paused, glancing at the attorneys on both sides. Every person in that courtroom tensed. Danielle inhaled sharply. Gregory leaned forward ever so slightly. The attorneys sat still, waiting for the final blow. But just as the gavel was about to come down, a small voice shattered the silence. "Wait!" Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Heads turned toward the back of the room. A boy no older than 10 stood up, his hands balled into fists at his sides. His face was flushed, his eyes burning with something raw and urgent. "That's not what happened." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the entire room, demanding attention. Danielle's face drained of color. Gregory's hand, which had been midair, froze. His fingers twitched before curling into a tight fist. Even Judge Wexler, known for his no-nonsense demeanor, hesitated before speaking. "Step forward, son." His voice remained firm, but there was something else there. A hint of curiosity, of caution. The boy swallowed hard and stepped forward. The soft scuffing of his sneakers against the polished floor, the only sound breaking the thick silence. His frame was small, swallowed up by an oversized sweater. He looked like any other 10-year-old, except for the sheer determination in his gaze. Judge Wexler adjusted his glasses, studying the boy carefully. "What's your name, son?" The boy's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Liam," he said. "Liam Miles." A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. Daniel's breath hitched at the sound of his last name. Gregory's fingers twitched against the table, but he said nothing. The judge nodded. "All right, Liam. You said, that's not what happened. What did you mean?" Liam hesitated, shifting on his feet. His gaze flickered between his parents, one looking pale, the other frozen like a statue. He took a deep breath, then squared his shoulders. "They lied," he said. A ripple of shock spread through the room. The words struck like a hammer against glass. Gasps, whispers. Even the attorneys exchanged stunned glances. Judge Wexler raised a hand, signaling for silence. Danielle let out a small, choked noise. Gregory's jaw tightened, his breathing suddenly heavier. The judge's expression remained unreadable. Lied about what? Liam blinked rapidly, his fingers curling into the hem of his sweater. He looked young in that moment. Just a scared child, caught in the middle of a war that wasn't his. But then his gaze hardened. The fights. The stories they told about each other. They're not true. His voice cracked, but he pushed through. They both wanted to win so bad. They'd made stuff up, but they forgot about me. A sharp intake of breath from Danielle. Gregory's grip tightened on the edge of the table. Judge Wexler leaned forward slightly. "Go on." Liam turned his head, looking straight at his mother. "They told you all these things to make themselves look better, but nobody asked me what really happened." His voice rose just a fraction. "Nobody asked me what I wanted." The weight of his words pressed down on everyone in that courtroom like a held breath. For the first time in the entire trial, it wasn't about Danielle or Gregory. It was about Liam. And no one was prepared for what he was about to say next. The truth no one expected. The courtroom felt different now. The grand walls, once imposing and filled with the authority of law, seemed smaller, almost suffocating. Everyone had come expecting a bitter custody battle, arguments between lawyers, and the final word of a judge. No one expected a 10-year-old boy to bring everything to a halt. Liam stood in the middle of the courtroom, a lone figure amidst a sea of adults who had been making decisions for him, never thinking to ask what he wanted. His words had struck like lightning. They both wanted to win so bad. They made stuff up, but they forgot about me. Judge Wexler's sharp eyes studied the boy carefully, his face impassive. He had seen thousands of cases like this, bitter disputes over children, accusations flying from both sides like daggers. But never had he seen a child take control of the narrative like this. The room was frozen, tension so thick it felt tangible. Danielle Carter, Liam's mother, sat rigidly in her chair, her hands now clasped together tightly, as if holding onto herself. Her lips were slightly parted, but she said nothing, as if afraid that speaking would shatter the fragile moment. Gregory Miles, Liam's father, looked equally as stunned. He had spent months carefully constructing his case, painting himself as the responsible, loving parent, and Danielle as the reckless, unfit mother. But now, under the watchful eyes of the courtroom, his carefully built story was beginning to show cracks. The judge tapped his fingers against the wooden bench, a rhythmic sound that brought everyone's attention back to him. He straightened his posture and addressed Liam. "Liam," Judge Wexler said, his voice controlled, measured, "you've just made a very serious claim. That your parents have lied during this case. Can you be more specific about what you mean?" Liam's small hands clenched into fists at his sides. He took a shaky breath and looked around the room. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of someone far older than his years. "Dad said Mom doesn't take care of me," he said. "That she forgets about me. That she's not there for me. But that's not true." Danielle inhaled sharply, tears forming in her eyes, but she held herself back. Liam turned to face his father. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. "You say you're always there for me," he said, his voice louder now. "But you aren't." Gregory's posture stiffened. His fingers curled into the expensive fabric of his suit. "That's not true, Liam," Gregory started, his voice controlled but strained. Liam shook his head. "It is true. You tell everyone you're the perfect dad, but you forget things. Big things. You tell me I'm the most important thing in your life. But I'm not." A hushed murmur rippled through the audience. Gregory exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Liam, that's not." "You forgot my soccer game," Liam interrupted, his voice filled with frustration. "I waited for you, Dad. I looked in the crowd. You told me you'd be there, and I believed you." His voice cracked. "But you weren't." Gregory flinched. The courtroom watched as the image of the perfect father he had painted for himself began to unravel. "You forgot to pick me up from school," Liam continued. "Mom had to leave work early to get me because you never showed up. And when I asked you why..." Liam's hands clenched tighter. "You told me you were busy." Gregory's jaw tightened. His fingers gripped the edge of the table. Judge Wexler's voice cut through the silence. "Busy with what, Liam?" The boy hesitated, then looked at the judge with pleading eyes. "His girlfriend," he said. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Danielle gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The attorneys exchanged glances. Gregory's face darkened. "Liam," he started, but the boy wasn't finished. "You told me I mattered, but you never made time for me," Liam said, his voice raw with emotion. "Mom stayed up with me when I had nightmares. Mom made me soup when I was sick. Mom never forgot about me." Danielle let out a soft, broken sob. She reached forward instinctively, but held herself back, as if afraid to interrupt. Gregory, however, was struggling to maintain his composure. His grip on the table was tight, his breathing shallow. Judge Wexler leaned forward. "Liam, earlier you said that your parents made things up to win this case. What did you mean by that?" Liam shifted uncomfortably. His fingers twisted the hem of his oversized sweater. "They told me what to say," he admitted. "Or, Dad did." The silence that followed was deafening. Danielle's body tensed. Gregory's face turned ashen. "What do you mean, Liam?" Judge Wexler asked, his voice calm but firm. Liam hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Dad told me that if I said I wanted to live with him, everything would be easier," he whispered. "That I wouldn't have to hear them fighting anymore. That I wouldn't have to see Mom cry." A strangled gasp left Danielle's lips. Gregory shifted in his seat. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something urgently in his ear, but Gregory barely reacted. He looked at Liam, his expression unreadable. Judge Wexler's gaze darkened. "Are you saying your father coached you to give false testimony?" Liam nodded. "He told me if I didn't do what he asked, I'd never see Mom again." The words slammed into the room like a shockwave. Danielle let out a choked sob, her hands covering her mouth. Her entire body shook. Even Gregory's lawyer looked unsettled. Gregory opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Judge Wexler exhaled, rubbing his temple. His voice was sharp when he spoke. "Mr. Miles, do you have a response?" Gregory swallowed, his usual confidence faltering. I never meant." Judge Wexler's gavel came down hard. "Enough." The courtroom fell silent. Gregory's lawyer tried to recover. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the child wasn't sworn in. This testimony." Judge Wexler shot him a look that made the man shrink back. "I'll be the one to determine relevance, counselor," the judge said sharply before turning back to Liam. "Son, you said your father lied about what you wanted. So let me ask you now." His voice softened slightly. "What do you want?" Liam didn't hesitate. He turned, walked straight to his mother's table, and grabbed her hand. "I want to stay with Mom." Danielle let out a sob and pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly. Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they weren't tears of sadness. Gregory watched, his face pale, his eyes empty. He had fought for months, built an entire case, manipulated the system, and yet in the end, he had lost the most important thing: his son. Judge Wexler exhaled. "Court will take a brief recess before I make my final ruling." But even as the gavel came down, the case wasn't over. Because just as Gregory stood up, defeated, another voice spoke. "I have proof." All heads turned. Daniel's lawyer, who had remained quiet through most of the trial, now stood, holding a folder. Gregory's expression darkened. Judge Wexler narrowed his eyes. "Go on." Daniel's lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, during our investigation, we retrieved text messages between Mr. Miles and his son." Gregory froze. Daniel's grip on Liam tightened. "Messages," the lawyer continued, "that proved beyond a doubt that Mr. Miles coerced Liam into lying." The courtroom held its breath. Judge Wexler extended his hand. "Let me see them." The lawyer walked forward, placing the folder in front of the judge. Gregory's lawyer ran a hand down his face, already knowing what was coming. Judge Wexler's eyes scanned the documents. He clenched his jaw. This changes everything. The final unraveling. The tension in the courtroom had reached an unbearable peak. Judge Wexler held the folder in his hands, flipping through the pages with deliberate slowness, his expression unreadable before, was now carved in stone. Gregory Miles sat rigid in his chair, his hands folded together on the table, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. But it was clear there was no saving this case. Danielle Carter, still clutching her son, wiped away her tears, but the emotions had not faded. Liam, her 10-year-old boy, had just changed the entire trial with his voice alone. And now, this evidence was about to confirm everything he had said. The gavel had barely come down for the recess, yet no one in the room had moved. The entire courtroom waited with bated breath. Judge Wexler finally closed the folder and set it down. He exhaled, pressing his fingertips together. "Counselor," he said, addressing Danielle's lawyer, "please summarize what I'm looking at here." Danielle's lawyer straightened his tie, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, these are text messages retrieved from Liam's phone and his email account. They were sent by Mr. Miles over the past few months. In these messages, he repeatedly instructed Liam on what to say in court. He explicitly told him to claim that his mother was unfit, despite Liam never having said so himself." A horrified murmur spread through the courtroom. Gregory's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched, clenching against the wooden surface of the table. Danielle swallowed hard, looking down at her son. He sat close to her, gripping her hand tightly. His small fingers trembled, but his expression was firm. Judge Wexler turned to Gregory. His voice was like a cold wind. "Mr. Miles, do you deny these messages?" Gregory hesitated. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, shaking his head. The meaning was clear. There's no way out of this. A muscle in Gregory's jaw twitched. He leaned forward, his voice lower, weaker than before. Your Honor, I may have sent some messages." "Some messages?" The judge arched an eyebrow. "Mr. Miles, I have over 50 pages of communication here that suggest otherwise." Gregory's lawyer stiffened beside him. It was clear even he hadn't known the extent of the evidence against his client. Judge Wexler adjusted his glasses. "I see messages where you tell your son to act sad when talking about your mother. Another one here says, 'Make sure you say she forgets to feed you.' Shall I continue?" The weight of the words hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud. Gregory swallowed hard. "Your Honor, I thought. You thought you could manipulate this court." Judge Wexler's voice was sharp. "You thought you could use your own son as a pawn in a custody battle." Gregory's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked down, shaking his head slightly, but he didn't argue. His silence was all the confirmation the court needed. Danielle let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth. She had known Gregory had been twisting the truth, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. Liam, still gripping her hand, spoke up. His voice, though small, cut through the thick silence. "He told me if I didn't do what he said, I'd never see Mom again." A gasp rippled through the audience. Gregory flinched, his face paling. "Liam." "No." The boy's voice rose, frustration leaking through. "You lied to me, Dad. You made me feel like I had to choose. Like if I didn't pick you, I'd lose my mom forever." His lip trembled, but he pushed forward. "I didn't want to lie. I never wanted to lie." Judge Wexler leaned back in his chair. He was no longer just a judge overseeing the case. In this moment, he was something more, an arbiter of justice, watching as the truth finally came to light. "Mr. Miles," he said, voice firm, "do you understand the gravity of what you've done? Not only have you misled this court, but you have emotionally manipulated your own child. That is not just unethical, it is despicable." Gregory inhaled sharply, but he didn't respond. Judge Wexler's voice remained steady. "Custody cases are not about winning or losing. They are about the child's best interests. And after hearing this testimony and reviewing this evidence, I have no doubt that Liam's well-being has not been your priority." Gregory finally lifted his gaze, and for the first time, his confident, polished image was shattered. He looked like a man who had just realized he had lost everything. But then, just as the tension seemed to peak, Danielle did something unexpected. She spoke. "Gregory." Her voice was hoarse, but there was strength in it. "Why?" Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but there was no anger in them, only sorrow. "Why did you do this?" Gregory looked away. For months, he had built an elaborate version of himself. The perfect father. The protector. The one Liam needed most. But now, stripped of his lies, he had nothing left but the truth. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Danielle blinked. Afraid of what? Gregory let out a shaky breath. His fingers curled against the table. "Afraid of losing him. Afraid that if he stayed with you, he wouldn't need me anymore." Danielle's lips parted, and even Liam's expression shifted slightly. Judge Wexler's expression didn't soften. "Mr. Miles, parenting is not about making sure your child needs you. It's about making sure they are safe and loved." Gregory didn't respond. For a long moment, silence stretched across the courtroom. Finally, Judge Wexler picked up his gavel. "I believe I have heard enough." Gregory stiffened. Danielle's breath hitched. Liam curled his fingers around his mother's sleeve. Judge Wexler exhaled slowly before delivering his verdict. "Effective immediately, full custody is awarded to Danielle Carter." Danielle gasped. Liam's grip on her hand tightened. Gregory's breath left him in a quiet exhale. Judge Wexler continued. "Mr. Miles, you will be granted supervised visitation rights only, pending further review. And let me be very clear. If I find any evidence that you attempt to manipulate, threaten, or coerce your son again, those rights will be revoked permanently. Do you understand?" Gregory nodded stiffly, but he didn't argue. Danielle turned to Liam, her eyes filled with disbelief. He looked up at her, and for the first time in months, he saw something in her gaze he hadn't seen before. Hope. Judge Wexler brought down the gavel. "Court is adjourned." The sound echoed through the room, final and absolute. Gregory sat motionless, as if frozen in time. His lawyer whispered something, but it barely registered. Danielle reached for Liam, pulling him into a tight hug. She pressed her lips to the top of his head, whispering over and over, "We're okay. We're okay." Liam closed his eyes, letting himself be held. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe. As the courtroom emptied, reporters rushing out to break the story, Gregory remained in his seat, staring blankly ahead. He had fought so hard to win, and in the process, he had lost the one thing that truly mattered: his son's trust. But as Liam and Danielle walked out of the courtroom together, hand in hand, there was no doubt. They were finally free. A father's regret, a son's healing. The courtroom was empty now. The voices that had once filled it with tension, accusations, and gasps of shock were gone. The reporters had rushed outside to spread the news, lawyers had packed up their files, and the audience had left with whispers of a case they wouldn't forget anytime soon. Only one person remained: Gregory Miles. He sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His breathing was shallow, his mind racing, replaying every moment, every mistake, every lie that had led him to this exact moment. For months, he had believed he was fighting to keep his son. Now, for the first time, he realized he had only been fighting to keep control. And in the process, he had lost everything. Across the room, a bailiff cleared his throat. "Sir, you need to leave." Gregory nodded slowly, pushing himself up from the chair. His body felt heavy, like a man carrying the weight of his own destruction. He grabbed his coat, his movements mechanical, but he didn't head straight for the exit. Instead, his eyes drifted to the side door, the one that led to the hallway where Danielle and Liam had disappeared. Would they still be there? Would his son even look at him? He hesitated. For years, Gregory had lived in a world where everything was calculated. He controlled his image, his success, his relationships. He had always been the one to dictate the terms. But standing here now, stripped of the illusion he had spent years crafting, He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Not fear of losing the case. Not fear of losing face. But the fear of something far worse. The realization that his own son might never forgive him. With a deep, shaky breath, he turned and walked toward the hallway. A mother's strength, a son's pain. Outside the courtroom, Danielle Carter sat on a wooden bench, her arms wrapped around Liam as he leaned against her. He had been quiet since the ruling, his small fingers gripping the fabric of her sweater. For months, she had fought to keep him, to protect him, to undo the damage that Gregory had inflicted. And now, after everything, she had finally won. But it didn't feel like a victory. She ran her fingers gently through Liam's hair, feeling the tension still lingering in his small body. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Liam didn't answer immediately. He just exhaled, his breath slow, controlled. "I don't know," he admitted. Danielle's heart ached. She knew that just because the legal battle was over, it didn't mean the wounds would heal overnight. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Her brows furrowed in confusion. "Sorry? Why, baby?" Liam turned his head slightly, looking up at her. His eyes were filled with something that broke her heart. Guilt. "I lied for him," he whispered. "I said things about you that weren't true. I let him tell me what to say." Danielle's breath hitched. She cupped his face gently, forcing him to look at her. "Liam," she said firmly but kindly, "you have nothing to be sorry for. You did what you thought you had to do. Your dad put you in a terrible position, and that wasn't fair." Liam looked down, his fingers tightening around the fabric of her sleeve. I didn't want to lose him." Danielle swallowed the lump in her throat. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling him closer. "And I know you love him. That's okay. You don't have to choose between us." Liam hesitated. "But I did." Danielle held him, wishing she could take away the pain he had been forced to endure. "You chose what was right. That's different." They sat in silence, mother and son, two people who had just been through an emotional war, but had come out the other side still holding on to each other. Then, a familiar voice made them both tense. "Liam." Danielle's body stiffened. She turned her head to see Gregory standing a few feet away. He looked different now, less like the confident man in the expensive suit, and more like someone who had been hollowed out from the inside. Liam didn't say anything. Gregory's gaze flickered to Danielle, as if asking for permission. She didn't speak, but she also didn't stop him. Taking a tentative step forward, Gregory exhaled. "Can I talk to you, son?" Liam looked up at his mother, his eyes searching hers. She gave him a small nod. Liam pulled away from her slightly, but didn't let go of her hand. "Okay." Gregory kneeled down, bringing himself to Liam's level. He tried to speak, but for the first time, he didn't know what to say. How do you apologize for something like this? How do you tell a 10-year-old that you had been so consumed by your own selfishness that you had used him as a weapon in a war he never should have been a part of? Finally, he just said the only thing that mattered. "I'm sorry." Liam didn't react right away. Gregory clenched his jaw. I thought I was doing the right thing. I told myself that I was fighting for you, that I was protecting you. But I wasn't, was I?" Liam's voice was quiet, but his words cut deep. "No." Gregory swallowed hard, nodding. "I hurt you. I lied to you. And I used you to hurt your mom." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Liam." Liam stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he let go of Danielle's hand and looked down at his own. "You told me I had to pick you," Liam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like I couldn't have both of you, like Mom didn't love me enough." Gregory flinched. Liam lifted his eyes, and for the first time, Gregory saw something in them he had never seen before. Disappointment. "I wanted to believe you," Liam said. "I really did." Gregory let out a shaky breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me, not right away," he admitted. But I promise, I'm going to be better. I won't lie to you again. I won't make you choose. I just want to be your dad." Silence. Then Liam did something that surprised Gregory. He nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. Gregory wiped a hand over his face and stood. "I'll give you some space," he said softly. "I just wanted you to know that I love you." Liam didn't respond, but he didn't turn away either. Gregory looked at Danielle. "I'll respect the court's decision," he said. "And I'll respect you. He hesitated. "I just hope one day I can fix what I broke." Danielle studied him for a moment before nodding. Gregory gave one last look at Liam before turning to leave. And as he walked away, Liam exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Danielle squeezed his hand. "You okay?" Liam looked up at her, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, he gave her a small, genuine smile. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Danielle pulled him into her arms, kissing the top of his head. They had been through the storm. But now, finally, they were stepping into the light. A new beginning, a broken past. Liam sat in the back seat of his mother's car, watching the courthouse disappear in the rearview mirror. The sky outside was a dull gray, as if the world itself had exhausted all its emotions in that courtroom. His hands rested in his lap, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on his jeans. His mother was driving, her face focused on the road, but every few seconds she would glance at him in the mirror, checking, watching. It felt strange. Not bad. Just different. For months, his life had been a battleground, his heart torn between his parents, his words twisted and used like weapons. He had been made to feel like a prize to be won, rather than a person with his own thoughts, his own fears. But now it was over. Yet, the weight of it still clung to his chest. Liam turned his gaze to the window, watching as the city streets blurred past him. Everything looked the same. Cars honking, people walking, buildings standing as they always had. But something inside him had changed. "Sweetheart." His mother's voice was gentle. Liam blinked, turning to her. "Yeah. You hungry?" Liam fought for a moment. He hadn't really eaten all day. He had been too nervous, too caught up in everything that had happened in that courtroom. But now, as the tension started to ease from his body, he realized just how empty he felt. "Yeah," he admitted. "A little." Danielle smiled softly. "How about your favorite place? Pancakes at Mel's." Liam's lips twitched upward slightly. Mel's Diner. His favorite. "Okay," he said. Danielle reached over, squeezing his knee gently before turning the car toward the small family-owned diner just a few blocks away. As they pulled into the parking lot, Liam saw the familiar red neon sign buzzing against the evening sky. A warmth settled in his chest. This place had always been their spot, his and Mom's. A place they went to after soccer games, before school sometimes, or when they just needed to escape the world for a little while. They slid into their usual booth by the window, and within moments, a waitress appeared, smiling. "Well, well, look who it is," she said playfully, placing 2 menus down. "Haven't seen you in a while, kiddo." Liam smiled back. "Yeah, been busy." The waitress chuckled. "Life has a way of doing that, doesn't it? Usual for you." Liam nodded. "Yes, please." She winked. "Coming right up." Danielle watched her go before turning her attention back to Liam. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," she said gently. "But if there's anything on your mind." Liam traced a finger along the table. "I keep thinking about Dad." Danielle inhaled, nodding. "I figured." "It's weird," Liam admitted. "I was so scared before. Scared to tell the truth. Scared of what would happen if I did. But now that it's all out there, I don't know how to feel." Danielle reached for his hand, holding it between hers. "That's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to figure it all out right away. Liam looked at her. Do you think he's mad at me? Danielle hesitated. I think he's more mad at himself than anyone else. Liam considered that. I don't want to hate him. Danielle's eyes softened. You don't have to. The words settled over him like a soft blanket. The truth was, even after everything, even after all the lies, the manipulation, the pain, he still loved his dad. But love didn't mean trust. And trust, that was something his dad would have to earn back. Their food arrived, and for the first time in a long time, Liam felt like a normal kid again. He and his mom talked about other things. The new Spider-Man movie, the science project he had due next week, the funny thing his friend Jake had done at school. It was nice. It was peaceful. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Liam felt safe. The weight of regret. Gregory Miles sat in his car, parked outside his apartment, staring at nothing. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The silence around him was deafening. For years, he had built his life around control, around power. He was the kind of man who always had a plan, always had the upper hand. But today, he had lost. Not just the case, not just custody. He had lost his son's trust. He had seen it in Liam's eyes, the way his son had looked at him not with anger, not with fear, but with disappointment. And somehow, that was worse. His phone buzzed beside him, but he ignored it. He already knew what the messages would say. His lawyer, telling him they needed to talk about his next steps. His colleagues, expressing their shock at how the trial had turned out. His so-called friends, who were no doubt whispering about how the great Gregory Miles had lost everything in court. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the boy he had let down. He ran a hand over his face, letting out a long, shaky breath. What had he done? He had let his pride, his ego, his fear drive him to do something unforgivable. He had made his son feel like he had to choose, and Liam had chosen. Gregory swallowed hard. He had always told himself he was a good father, that everything he had done was for Liam's sake. But today had proven the truth. Liam didn't need a father who won court battles. He needed a father who listened, who put him first, who didn't make him feel like love was something to be fought for. Gregory exhaled shakily, his vision blurring for a moment. He had failed his son. But was there a way to fix it? Could he fix it? He didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to try. And trying, he realized, was the only thing he had left. The road to healing. Liam sat on the floor of his bedroom, his back against the bed, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the last few months pressed against his chest, but it didn't feel as heavy as before. It had been a week since the trial. 7 days since he had stood up in that courtroom and spoken the truth. And in those 7 days, things had changed. His mother smiled more. Not the forced, tired smiles she had worn for months, but real ones, ones that reached her eyes. Their home felt lighter, like a dark cloud had finally lifted. Liam's phone buzzed next to him, making him jump slightly. He reached for it, his heart thudding when he saw the name on the screen. Dad. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the screen. Since the trial, his dad had only texted once, to tell him he loved him. Liam hadn't replied. Not because he didn't love his dad. He did. But love didn't erase what had happened. It didn't erase the fact that his father had lied, that he had made Liam feel like a prize to be won instead of a person. He took a breath and unlocked his phone. Dad. Hey, buddy. I don't know if you want to talk yet, but I'd love to see you. No pressure. Just whenever you're ready. Liam stared at the message for a long time. Then, finally, he typed a response. Liam. Okay. A moment later, his phone buzzed again. Dad. Really? Okay. When? Where? Liam bit his lip, thinking. Liam. Mel's Diner. Tomorrow after school. There was a long pause before the reply came. "Dad, I'll be there." Liam exhaled, setting his phone down. It wasn't a fix. It wasn't everything magically being okay. But it was a step. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. A father's redemption. Gregory Miles sat in a booth at Mel's Diner, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. The familiar hum of conversation filled the space, but he barely heard it. His thoughts were too loud. He had barely slept. He had barely eaten. For days, all he had done was replay the courtroom over and over in his head. The way his son had looked at him. The way the truth had unraveled his carefully built world. And now he was here, waiting for Liam, hoping his son would actually show up, hoping he hadn't ruined things beyond repair. The bell above the diner's door jingled. Gregory's head snapped up. Liam stood there, wearing his usual oversized hoodie, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His eyes met Gregory's, and for a second, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Liam made his way to the booth. Gregory swallowed hard. "Hey, buddy." "Hey." Liam slid into the seat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Gregory cleared his throat. "Thanks for coming." Liam nodded, but didn't say anything. Gregory exhaled, gripping his coffee cup tighter. "I don't know where to start," he admitted. Liam tilted his head. "The truth." Gregory let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, the truth." He set his cup down. "Liam, I messed up. I did something really, really wrong. And I hurt you. I know that. And I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But," he hesitated, "I need you to know I'm sorry. Not just for the court stuff. Not just for making you lie. But for all of it." Liam stared at him for a long time. "You made me feel like I had to pick," he said quietly. Gregory's stomach twisted. "I know. You made me feel like Mom didn't love me enough." Gregory's throat tightened. "I know," he whispered. Liam looked down at his hands, his fingers curling into the sleeves of his hoodie. "I was scared," he admitted. "I thought if I didn't do what you said, I'd lose you. And I didn't want that." Gregory's heart shattered. How had he done this to his own son? "Liam," he said, voice thick with emotion, "you will never lose me. Ever. And you should have never felt like you had to choose. That was my fault. Not yours." Liam swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can trust you." Gregory nodded, his chest aching. "I get that. And I don't blame you. But I want to earn it back, however long that takes." Liam was quiet for a long time. Then finally, he sighed. "Can we just talk? Like normal?" Gregory blinked. "What do you mean?" "Not about court. Not about what happened. Just about stuff." A small, cautious smile tugged at Gregory's lips. Yeah, we can do that." Liam sat back in his seat. "Did you see the new Spider-Man trailer?" Gregory laughed, some of the tension easing from his body. "I did. Looks awesome." And just like that, for the first time in a long time, they talked. Not about court. Not about the past. Just a father and a son, sharing a moment. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a full fix. But it was a start. And that was enough. Healing takes time. For the first time in a long time, the conversation between Gregory and Liam felt normal. They talked about movies, about school, about Liam's latest obsession with space documentaries. Gregory listened, really listened. He laughed at Liam's stories, nodded along when his son spoke about things he was excited about, and asked questions instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. It was small, it was simple, but it was everything. After nearly an hour, Liam started picking at his napkin, his fingers tugging at the paper. His gaze flickered toward the window, his mind clearly somewhere else. Gregory noticed. "You okay, buddy?" he asked carefully. Liam hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know. Gregory leaned forward. You can tell me. Whatever it is. Liam was quiet for a long time before finally saying, I don't know what happens now. Gregory's breath caught in his throat. It was such a simple statement, but it held so much weight, because he didn't know what happened next either. I guess, Gregory said slowly, that's up to you. Liam looked at him, eyebrows furrowing. I'm not going to push you, Liam, Gregory continued. I'm not going to force anything. I know I broke your trust, and I know that's not something that just comes back overnight. He exhaled, staring down at the table. I don't deserve it yet, but I want to deserve it. I want to be the kind of dad you want to be around, not the one you feel like you have to be around. Liam bit his lip, staring at the cup of hot chocolate in front of him. You used to be, he mumbled. Gregory's throat tightened. What? Liam looked up. You used to be that kind of dad. Before the fighting. Before court. He shifted uncomfortably. Before everything got bad. Gregory felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs, because hearing those words from his son, knowing that he had once been a good father, that he had once had Liam's trust, hurt more than anything. I miss that dad, Liam admitted. Gregory swallowed the lump in his throat. I miss that dad too. They sat in silence for a long time. Then, hesitantly, Gregory spoke again. I don't expect things to be like before, he admitted, but I do want us to be okay again, even if it takes a while. Liam studied him carefully, searching his face for something. For the first time, Gregory didn't try to act like he had all the answers. He just sat there, open, waiting. Finally, Liam let out a breath. I think I'd like that too. Gregory felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized was there. Liam still wasn't ready to trust him fully. That would take time. But he was willing to try. And that was more than Gregory could have ever hoped for. How about this? Gregory said. No pressure, no expectations, just small steps. We see each other when you want to. We talk when you want to. No forcing anything. Just us figuring it out as we go. Liam nodded slowly. Yeah, that sounds good. Gregory smiled. It was small. It was cautious. But it was real. They finished their food, the conversation light again. When the check arrived, Gregory slid a few bills onto the table and stood. Can I walk you home? He asked. Liam hesitated for just a second, then nodded. Okay. They left the diner together, stepping out into the cool evening air. The city buzzed around them, cars honking, people laughing, the neon lights of the diner casting a soft glow on the pavement. Gregory stuffed his hands in his pockets, walking slowly beside Liam. He didn't try to hold his son's hand. He didn't try to make the moment into something bigger than it was. He just walked. After a few minutes, Liam spoke. I still love you, you know. Gregory nearly tripped over his own feet. His chest tightened, and he had to swallow hard before answering. I love you too, buddy. More than anything. Liam didn't say anything else. He just kept walking, his hoodie pulled up against the cold, his small form beside his father. Gregory exhaled, looking up at the night sky. Things weren't fixed. They weren't perfect, but they didn't have to be. Because healing wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about taking the first step. And today, they had taken that step together. And that was enough. For now.